Between everything he does this episode and his really, really cozy looking sweatshirt, Saru was definitely giving off some BKD energy in this episode. Big Kelpian daddy energy. Yes, hello interwebs and welcome to my review of Spider-Man Far From Home. I'm sorry, wait, what? Not Spider-Man? Oh, Star Trek Discovery, excuse me. Star Trek Discovery Season 3, Episode 2, Far From Home. I had to make the joke. It was a bit obvious. It's just kind of funny. Strangely enough, this is not part 2. Episode 1 was called That Hope Is You Part 1. This is not part 2, so maybe we'll get That Hope Is You Part 2 at some point down the road. Kind of curious about that. But anyways, regardless of the weird titling of this episode, I'm going to give my spoiler-free thoughts of this episode, the second episode of Star Trek Discovery Season 3 up front, and then I'm going to get into my spoiler thoughts. So if you haven't seen the episode yet, you got a little bit of time to enjoy me ranting about the episode before you have to turn it off and wait until you can watch it yourself. That sounded very passive-aggressive. I'm sorry if that came across as passive-aggressive. Watch the episode whenever you want to. I'll be here. It's fine. It's not like I'm going anywhere. Speaking on that, though, before we actually get started, I just want to address the elephant in the room. Of course, I am actually in Seattle now. Yes, I have officially moved. I know everything kind of looks the same, except for kind of mirror flopped this way now because the setup's kind of different, but I am officially in my new apartment in Seattle. I'm still setting everything up, but of course I had to set up this stuff first so I could rant at the camera for you. So just know that you are my top priority, everybody. I'll talk about that more in my live stream coming up next week. We'll get into the nitty-gritty of my life, but for now, I'm sure that most of you do not care about the life of this person in this video. You just want to hear my random thoughts about Star Trek, so let's get into it. Kind of similarly to the premiere episode of the season, this episode was basically telling a very functional, familiar story, one that we've seen all before. In fact, this episode is very much evoking a Western. It wasn't even coy about it. It was very much evoking that sort of like Western-y kind of story that we've seen of like the outsider coming into town and helping out the locals sort of thing. Wasn't even subtle about it. So it was a very functional story that we've all seen before. There was no real surprises, but it was doing that in service of really honing in on other things and trying to get us focused on other things instead of getting bogged down by some crazy over-the-top strange story. But unlike the premiere episode, which had a lot of expositional heavy lifting to do to really set us up of where we're at in the universe of Star Trek now that we've jumped forward so many centuries into the future, this didn't have to do any of that exposition. So what it allowed it to do is really hone in and focus on a lot of our characters and sort of set up some character arcs and set up some interesting stories for our characters within this episode and sort of see where some possible tensions may be going throughout the season, while also giving us a nice little capper arc within the episode itself. Also, one other thing I will say about the episode is I like that this one felt a lot more low energy. Unlike the premiere episode, which is like very fast, very high octane, like kind of very Kelvin timeline-y Star Trek movie, like moving really quick while getting all the exposition out. This episode, though, while there was some high-stakes stuff going on, I mean, all of our characters could have presumably died in this episode, I never really felt like, oh my gosh, everything needs to happen right now. It never felt like very fast-paced. And I actually kind of appreciated that. Star Trek Discovery has always been a show that's always felt like very fleet-footed and very on the move. And so I kind of enjoyed that this episode felt a little bit slower-paced and really got us to sit with the characters and really feel what's going on with them and where they are at all psychologically. So I deeply enjoyed that. And I will say that was backed up by the very somber-esque score by, I hope it's Jeff Rousseau still. I didn't check to see if it was the same composer, but if it is the same composer, it would be Jeff Rousseau. I think his sort of more somber, laid-back score for this episode was a good choice. I noticed it most clearly during the action sequences in this episode, where, you know, normally we'd have these like big bombastic numbers going on with the action sequences like we saw in the premiere, but for this one it was much more slower and toned down for the music, and I really feel like that helped carry a lot of the speed and mood for the episode, and I greatly appreciated that slight change of pace. This episode was also a great showcase for Doug Jones's Saru in this episode. While Doug Jones didn't get as much to do in terms of acting range as Sonequa Martin Green did in last episode, I do think he gives a very fantastic and solid performance this episode, really showing us, without spoiling too much, the kind of person that we all kind of hoped that Saru could and would be, and I really just enjoyed that deeply from him. Again, I don't think he necessarily gave like the Emmy-winning performance that I think Sonequa Martin Green may have given last episode, but I definitely think it was a very strong performance from Doug Jones. And so to wrap out my spoiler-free thoughts here, I will say Overall, while I did really like this episode and thought it was very, very interesting, and I thought it gave us some good character setups and wisely focused a lot more on this sort of smaller scale stuff with the characters, I did find most of it to be fairly perfunctory and predictable. There was really nothing in this episode that deeply surprised me. I kind of saw where all the character arcs were going to go. I kind of saw where everything was going to end. So I wasn't really shocked by anything. And I don't just mean that in terms of the plot, I mean that also in terms of the character arcs as well. But despite that, the episode still comes out being a very positive one for me, just on the back of the strong interactions between the characters, the strong writing of all the characters, and the strong performance of all the characters. So while none of it was surprising, it was executed perfectly well. I don't think you could have executed this kind of story all that much better. But it was a story that I kind of saw coming. So a solid episode, but nothing that really stands out as super great for me. But that's it for my spoiler-free thoughts on Star Trek Discovery Far From Home. Let's jump into the spoilers. So if you haven't seen the episode, get off here and we will keep on going. So the start of the episode begins with the Discovery landing on the planet. I loved the sort of like exploded asteroid-y feel look of this. I will say that we did learn that Star Trek Discovery was the first show during quarantine to be done entirely from home, to have all of its visual effects, I can't speak for some reason, done from home. And I think the team deserves all the praise because it looks phenomenal. They really, really deserve praise here, and they should 100%. Again, I keep saying Emmy worthy, but it definitely is Emmy worthy here. They did an excellent job with all the visual effects throughout the episode. During the crash scene, I love Jet Reno sort of giving her quips and things like "my back hurts" and things like that. Tig Notaro is just so perfectly comedic, and I adore her. Also, she was on the recent Star Trek podcast, which I highly recommend you listen to because she is just absolutely hysterical, bouncing off of Paul F. Tompkins there. The only other things I will say for this opening crash scene is I loved Owo and Detmer saying "brace" at the same time, like twice. That was hysterical. I will say also during the crash, I was thinking of Beta Artemis, who is a member of this channel's community, who is always ranting about seatbelts in Star Trek, and I was just literally thinking the entire time, like, why does no one have seatbelts? Like, Detmer literally gets thrown over the console, and there was like people walking in the background as the ship was crashing. I'm like, people, come on, actually brace, like sit down or like get behind something. Don't just like be holding your console like Tilly was. It bugs me that Star Trek has always been bad about seatbelts, with a couple notable exceptions here and there. After the opening credits, everyone's on the planet. I did like we get this moment of everyone clapping for Detmer and sort of giving her congratulations, but obviously Detmer seems out of it. We get the hint that it has something to do with her metal implant, but we don't know that for sure. And I'll just sort of talk about Detmer quickly here. There's a couple scenes throughout the episode where we see that she's definitely out of it. Something's wrong with her, but we also hear from the doctor that there's nothing physically wrong with her. So I'm assuming she's either going through some alien influence stuff or stuff with time travel that influenced her, or more likely she has some sort of PTSD from the crash, because there's that moment where she's looking at someone who had died during the crash and said, oh, this person died, and I get the sense that she feels responsibility for that, and she may also be feeling PTSD from the Battle of the Binary Stars. But that doesn't really get resolved by the end of the episode. She's still kind of in that mode when we are taking off with the Discovery ship towards the end. So I'm assuming that this is a setup for her character going throughout at least the next few episodes, or maybe the whole season, of her dealing with PTSD, which I'm actually very excited for. While I wish we got a little bit more of it within this episode, I'm really glad that the character Detmer is getting a lot more to do, and we're actually getting to build out some of the side characters on the bridge as well. We also got to see a lot more of them, like Bryce, as well throughout this episode, though not a lot of character stuff for them. Though I will say I did like Oo showing a lot of concern for Detmer and actually being the primary one to notice that something's off with Detmer. So that's sort of giving Detmer a little bit of, Oo a little bit more to do on the back of Detmer's development. So I'm really liking that we're getting a little bit more of these characters, but again, it wasn't really the focus. So I kind of need to see how it all pays off later on to really, really hone in on that storyline. The other thing, too, I will say about these opening scenes is Saru is captaining like a boss. Like, literally, I take notes throughout the episode, and literally almost every scene was Saru is captaining like a boss. He's just so wonderful. Like I said, Doug Jones just gives a great performance, and I will call out one specific scene, but there's so many moments throughout this episode where he just stands up and gives some great captain speeches. I love that he says, we're all adrift, but we're together in this. I like that he says, we need to focus on the ship first. There's a lot of stuff that we're all going to be get curious about, but really we need to focus here first and get this done. That's really what a captain should be doing, is like saying, look, I'm addressing your concerns, but we need to focus on this. And just giving that calm, authoritative, like, daddy. Why am I like weirdly dadifying Saru? Very strange. But I do like that he was just a strong captain throughout this whole episode. Then we also get Georgiou coming in and immediately kind of wanting to get off, go meet Burnham. We kind of know that she has a thing for protecting Burnham. And I like that she is sort of a counterbalance to Saru in this episode. I will say some of their conflict felt a bit forced towards the beginning of the episode. There's this whole conversation when they go to the ready room and they determine that they want to go check out the settlement that's nearby because they need some supplies. And Saru sort of gives this answer of like, we're not going to reveal a lot about ourselves because first contact, we don't want to unduly influence events, the sort of prime directive-y argument. And I will say that argument didn't work necessarily. It felt a bit convoluted and forcibly trying to get Georgiou and Saru to be at odds, when really I feel like they could have just simplified it a little bit more and just said, Saru said, we don't know what's out there. We don't know if we can trust these people. We're not going to reveal ourselves right now. It felt like it was trying to root Saru's conflict in sort of this moral standing of Starfleet and sort of the prime directive and we won't influence people. But it did feel a tad overly convoluted in trying to make that point that he was sort of standing firm in Starfleet values against Georgiou going against Starfleet values. I like the scene towards the end of the episode where he stands up for not killing the bad guy in this episode versus Georgiou who wants to kill the bad guy. That was a lot less convoluted, a lot more clear of Starfleet value versus non-Starfleet values. But this sort of conflict with Georgiou really did not work for me at the top of the episode because it just felt a tad too convoluted to try to get to the point of like Starfleet values versus non-Starfleet values between the two of them. But I like the concept of it. And I like how it pays off towards the end. I also like the running bit that Georgiou has like Leland's gunk on her shoes. And then we see later there's like a Havoc guy, Jet Reno calls him like Hazmat, cleaning up the stuff. It's like, my name is like, I forgot his name already too. And Jet Reno's like, yeah, I forgot his name already. I'm sure some people complain like, oh, we don't need that gore in Star Trek. And I can kind of see that because Leland kind of was an unfortunate bystander that he got taken over by Control. So it feels a little bit weird that we're very vindictive about this guy who basically got Borgified in his own weird way. He wasn't really a Borg, but you know what I'm trying to say there. So I will say it's a little bit awkward that we're relishing in his gore that like she apparently just smashed into a pulp. But I also found it kind of funny. So maybe I'm just a terrible person. That's probably the answer. One other storyline that was going on throughout this episode as well that I should mention was Hugh and Paul. The first scene that we get between Hugh and Paul, I really, really loved the visual storytelling there where Paul is sort of out of it and there's no one around, and then he gets brought out of his sort of coma by Hugh with the hypo spray or whatever it is. And I just like the visual storytelling. He's all by himself, and then we pull back and we see so much going on around him. It's suddenly very, very, busy and hubbub going on. I also will say, on the back of that comment, I will say the camera work throughout this episode was much more precise and much more confident in its visual storytelling. Star Trek Discovery Season 2 and Season 1 as well tended to do this thing where it was just like, we're going to move the camera, just move the camera. It's dynamic. We're doing flips and turns and movement and upside down stuff. It was just a lot of like camera movement for camera movement's sake. But a lot of the times in this episode, I really enjoyed that the camera would pull in and out of doorways and you would get the fringes of people doing stuff outside the room that we're focusing on in the episode, really kind of giving this sense of there's a lot going on in the ship. Everything feels very hectic. So everything felt very claustrophobic and a lot of stuff and a lot of movement going on, but the camera was itself telling us that story and moving very precisely. So credit to the cinematographer and the director on this episode for really using the camera dynamic movement in this episode much more precisely than previous seasons of Star Trek Discovery have done. So excellent job on the visual storytelling angle there. I will say for Paul and Hugh, I love their chemistry. The two actors, Wilson Cruz and Anthony Rapp, just play off of each other so perfectly. I like that we're finally sort of getting to see them as an actual couple again after spending most of season 2 with them kind of ripped apart because of Culber's PTSD that he was dealing with. So I'm liking that they have conflict, but it's conflict that feels out of them being a confident couple rather than them being at odds with each other. So I really liked that sort of loving dynamic that they able to bring to each other. Like the t-shirt joke was absolutely hysterical and very, very cute. Hugh basically says, you can't do any work, stay in this pod. But then obviously Stamets gets up and wants to help and is in pain. He runs to Jet Reno, who kind of pokes him and prods him and says, like, look, you need to not push yourself too hard. I was a bit confused by how much time had passed. We had sort of gotten the implication that he was still deeply, deeply hurt and couldn't get up out of his bed. But then he was going up and helping Jet Reno. So I was a bit confused, like, was it a few hours? Was it a whole day? I'm assuming it was only a few hours, but it was just a little bit confusing for me there. But I like that Jet Reno sort of calls him on his crap, but doesn't stop him. And so I found that whole element of the story to be a bit, again, a little bit forced, more than I would have liked. But I did like that it was sort of like showing Stamets like being a man. I want to, get this stuff done, and showing that that's not always the smartest move. But he does ultimately save the day. So now that I'm kind of thinking, I really don't like the story all that much. I like the conflict that it brings sort of naturally out of Stamets and Hugh, and it makes sense that Stamets would want to help in that situation, but it wasn't, the message wasn't as clear in the end, because we didn't like get a capstone scene where he was like, you need to take care of yourself, you can't always do this by yourself. And ultimately Stamets saves the day anyways, and even though he rips his sutures open. So I don't know, I feel like there was a missing scene to really hone in on the message of the Hugh Stamets storyline. Ultimately I liked it. I like this sort of like Stamets pushing himself too hard and needing to learn a lesson, but I don't think he learned it. So I think ultimately that storyline peters out a little bit more than I would have liked. But overall, I will say I love Jet Reno, I love Hugh, and I love Stamets, and every single scene that they're in is absolutely fantastic, hysterical, and full of a lot of love between all these actors. You can definitely see that they have a lot of chemistry between all three of them. I just wish we had gotten one more scene to really cap off that storyline. All right, well, this brings me to our final storyline, which is Saru and Tilly going off to the settlement and dealing with all of that stuff. So I really love the opening scene with Saru and Tilly walking to the settlement. That's probably my favorite scene of the entire episode, with Tilly sort of doing her usual talking too much stuff that she sort of like rants and talks stuff out. And she calls it out. She says, I know I'm talking because I talk too much when I'm afraid. And Saru, being the most encouraging captain of all time, basically saying like, I know, keep doing it. It helps you. And also sometimes it helps us think of new things. And she asked the question, why did you bring me? I mean, so many other people could have come and done this. And that's what I was asking too. I mean, Nan would have been a great choice as well, because she's the security chief. Bring her along. But I understand she needs to stay on the ship to organize things, though apparently badly, because Georgiou slips away later on. But I do like that he admits that you make a good first impression, and that pays off, but they don't call it out that it paid off later on, which I like that this show didn't go like, see how that paid off right here? We did the paying off thing. Like Saru saying like, see, you make a good first impression, Tilly. I like that Saru basically says, hey, you make a good first impression. We get this really heartwarming scene between the two of them. We see Saru being a really encouraging captain, and someone who's, even in all of this chaos, everything going on, he's still taking the time to foster the leadership and confidence of his fellow crew members. So he's not only being a good captain in terms of dealing with the situation, but he's also encouraging crew members in the midst of a crisis situation. Like, there's no better. I'm just going to say this. Saru is an excellent captain based on what we see in this episode. I'm just so glad that it looks like, and I hope he gets to be captain over Michael. I love Michael Burnham. She is my sweetheart, and I adore her so much. I love her character, but I really want Saru to be captain. I really think Michael should become captain maybe in like the last episode of the series. That's just my thought. But I just really love Saru being captain of the Discovery. He does it so well. Then we finally get to the settlement. There's a brief standoff. And they're, again, like I said in my spoiler-free section, they're very much evoking Western. This bar has like the saloon doors. The guy coming in is very much like I'm the bad guy taking advantage of the town sort of thing. This is sort of the storyline that we've all kind of seen before. It's like the good guys show up, they stand for values, the bad guys taking advantage of the town needs the good guys to come in and help them, and the good guys are just kind of there, just need to get like their equipment to save the ship. It's very much like a very Western story, and again, I like that Discovery very much doesn't hide from that fact. It's very much like, no, this is a Western, down from the saloon doors down to the spurs on the guy's shoe. We're doing a Western. And considering Star Trek has always kind of had that space Western-y vibe to it, I really like that they just made that they just evoked that very clearly. It was a lot of fun, even if the story was fairly standard. Also, by evoking the Western, it really gets us to this frontier idea that the Federation really is gone, and as the guy says, they are all adrift together, that there really is no overriding force. And so I like that sort of twisting of Saru's words and themes and using the Western genre to evoke the sense of the loss of the Federation and its stabilizing force. But I liked that the story got us to really hone in on a lot of the themes that I think this season is really trying to get to, which is Starfleet stands for something. And even though it's disappeared, people still want to believe in it, still want to believe that it's out there. So I love that this guy, Cal, was really like, yeah, the Starfleet will help us. They can do this thing. They can, I really believe in them. And you know, Saru and Tilly living up to that ideal of Starfleet. And we also get that scene where Tilly's like says, you know, Starfleet officers, you know, when she makes the good first impression, which I mentioned earlier. I liked that they didn't beat the nail on the head that she did that. Then we obviously get the bad guy shows up. He kills Cal. That actually really hit me hard. I was surprised. Again, I liked that even though this guy Cal had only been in 2 scenes so far, his death really kind of struck me. It was very brutal. And very gruesome. Again, I'm sure some people have a problem with it in terms of how gruesome it was and killing this guy who was just very sweet, but I understand why they did it for the story. Maybe it didn't need to be as gruesome, but for me, I think it really showed and raised the stakes for this character. I will say also the bad guy coming in, the sort of Courier. Again, we sort of get little references to stuff that we learned from Michael Burnham's episode last season, like the dilithium being valuable, Courier being gone. I also will say, quick note, sorry to jump to a different thing, but the Courier also says Vadresh, which is how the word Federation was said way back in the short trek Calypso. So there's a subtle tying between Calypso and this current episode of Star Trek Discovery. So I like that callback to that short trek because I'm really still kind of curious where Calypso fits in to everything, given where we're at in Star Trek Discovery Season 3. So I am curious if they're going to eventually explain what was going on with Calypso at some point. But anyways, I just like that little call out there. But anyways, we get this Courier showing up. I like that it's sort of referencing stuff that we already know, but Saru's sort of out of his element in this whole thing. And I like that Georgiou shows up and shows that her value to the team isn't just, you know, being an engineer and being an annoyance. She can actually help them and beat up people. But again, we get this conflict between Saru and Georgiou, and I like that it plays out between Saru and Georgiou that he doesn't want her to kill the guy and she doesn't want to let him go free, and Saru ultimately wins out. And because Saru stands up for Starfleet values, the other guy, the bartender who was friends of Cal, ultimately also does the right thing. He doesn't kill the bad guy, even though he could have. Sure, he probably will lead to his own death by being out there on the parasitic ice, but I like that there's this sort of element of these themes that I'm going to assume will run throughout the season, which is the more that the characters of Discovery stand for Starfleet values and show off Starfleet values and show that Starfleet stands and still can mean something, that it will inspire others to also do the right thing going forward. And so I really kind of enjoy that theme, and I like that Georgiou sort of exemplifies the opposite of that theme of like, if you do the right thing, that's dumb. She's very kind of pragmatic in that sense instead of idealistic. And Star Trek has always been an idealistic show, but Discovery's always been the show that's like that fight between idealism and pragmatism. So I like that it's evoking the themes of Discovery as a whole, but also this sort of themes of the season between this conflict between Saru and Georgiou. And I like that it was much more simplified in the end instead of this like convoluted mess towards the beginning of the episode. It was very much simplified in sort of like, do we kill this guy? Do we not kill this guy? We don't kill this guy. And it also inspires others to not kill people as well. I think that worked out very perfectly. Story's fairly standard, but I liked that it really allowed the writers to hone in and show us what they want to say this season, to hopefully then complicate it as the season goes on and we get more and more complex stories as the season goes on. So I just like them sort of going back to basics and sort of building out from there throughout this episode. Also, just random speculation here, but I do wonder if the bartender guy will eventually go out and tell the tale of the Starfleet crew that came to help his town, and that's sort of the beginnings of how the word of Starfleet spreads. And I wonder if we'll get a callback to the Discovery crew saving this town later on in the season as sort of their story and legend grows, again evoking that sort of Western feel of the legend of the Discovery as they ride into town and save the good old days. I really think that sort of Western feel, really, the more I think about it, is, I hope, an overriding feel for this season, because I really think it kind of gets to the heart of what this show wants to say with this season. And I think that the beginnings of it are right here. And I think that's ultimately everything that I have to say about the episode. We go back to the ship gets fixed, and then the last thing, Michael Burnham shows up and saves the crew, and apparently it's been a year since she's last seen the Discovery crew, so there's been a year basically between last episode and this episode of Discovery showing up, and Michael Burnham's clearly gone through a lot. I think I'll have to see how next episode plays out before I can really comment on that. I will say I was a bit sad that Michael Burnham kind of shows up immediately. I would have liked a little bit more time with Burnham and Discovery being separated from each other and sort of maybe working to meet each other. It did seem a bit forced that she just sort of shows up right in the nick of time to save them. Certainly by no means the most egregious example I've seen of that in Discovery or in Star Trek as a whole. That happens all the time at people conveniently showing up. So I'm not really necessarily bothered too much by it. I'm just sort of like, I wish we had gotten a little bit more time with them separated. But again, we don't know what next episode's going to be. Maybe next episode will be that year that Michael Burnham had off between finding Discovery, and sort of like takes a step back and sort of gives us that in-between time period. So maybe we'll get a little bit more with them being separated, or maybe episode 3 will go on and we'll sort of see them together from this point on, which would be a bit disappointing, because I think there was a bit more stories to be told with the characters being separated. But we'll sort of see how everything plays out. I can't really judge it based on the last 2 seconds of the episode. I kind of see where they're going to go with it in order to really judge it. But like I said, overall, I think this was a solid episode. It gave us some clear themes, some interesting character arcs. I have some quibbles here and there. I don't think this was a out-and-out spectacular episode. The story was fairly standard, but I do think there was some really wonderful moments off the back of our character interactions and building out the themes of the episode. And also, Doug Jones just gives a phenomenal performance. So generally, good episode, not great episode. I really enjoyed it. So yeah, what did you think, though? Enough of me ranting. What did you think of Far From Home? Not the Spider-Man movie, but the episode of Discovery. Let me know down in the comments below. Also, if you want more reviews and discussions of Star Trek and Star Trek Discovery, I do that all the time on this channel, as well as many other things. So don't forget to subscribe to get all of that. I also have a Patreon where you can help me, especially right now, and considering I just moved across the West Coast from LA to Seattle, so money is tight, and so Patreon really helps me pay the bills at the moment. But regardless of all that stuff, whether you subscribe, whether you comment, whether you patron, whether you agree with me that Saru is a very wonderful Kelpian daddy, I don't know where that joke is coming from. I don't know what I'm doing with that. I'm just going to stop. Regardless of all that stuff, thank you so much for joining me. I hope that you, as always, live long and prosper. A huge thank you to my amazing patrons who make this channel happen, and an extra special thank you to Miranda Janelle, Ashley Allen Bokikio, Eli Berg-Moss, Ashlyn Solstice, Christina Dalliance, Greg Gillum, Stephen Kleinard, Boyd and Mary Beth Earl, Wellington Marcus, Wayne Twitchell, Buttoneer, Ish the Mad, Munir Amlani, John Steele, Gavin Robinson, William Stewart, Michael Beam, Spock TOS, BBD, Nathan Olson, The Sir Spence, Zach Cody, Bree Beecher, Maeve, Chloe Dollar, Subraxis, Wen Dizzle Bizzle, Tanya Trummer, Gretchen Badger, Dante St. James, Polly Mina, Piston Twisted Garage, Mark the Edge, and Din. I could not do this without all of you, so thank you so much, especially this month.